take into account also the courage and the contributions and the commitment of students.
And these students were really on the front line. They were in reality were the troops of, in a real sense, the civil rights movement.
And unsung heroes in many ways.
Well, you know, Dr. Baldwin, when you look at the Civil Rights Act of 1964, what could you say in reference to pulling all of this together? That is, all the activity that has gone on dealing with civil rights and et cetera, and yet still, even today, we find that there are still some questions in reference to non-discrimination and those things.
Exactly. I think it speaks to the fact that the hopes and dreams and expectations that people had revolving around the Civil Rights Act of 1964 have not materialized. So we're still dealing with problems in terms of housing discrimination. We're still dealing with battles over civil rights legislation. We're still dealing with discrimination in other areas of American life, and also personal racism, not just institutional racism, but personal racism. So I think it speaks to the fact that I don't think it speaks well of the legacy of not only the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but civil rights legislation in general. Somehow or another, we have failed to implement the guidelines, the provisions set forth in these particular pieces of legislation. One other point I might add, I spoke earlier of the direct connection between the civil rights movement and the introduction of the Civil Rights Act. I think we have to also take into account the fact that the federal government helped create that climate, because the Johnson administration, President Lyndon Johnson, was determined to get the Civil Rights Act of 1964 through Congress. And he met a lot of resistance from Southern Dixiecrats. But he, I think, figured prominently at that level. But once the Civil Rights Act was passed, the federal government, I think, began to retreat from its commitment. And, of course, the provisions of the Act have not, even up to this point, been fully implemented.
And so now, Dr. Baldwin, we are more than 40 years beyond the Act of 1964.
Right.
And I don't think that we can identify any civil rights legislation in a real sense that would even come close to the Act of 1964.
Exactly.
Would you suggest that perhaps it might be time to revisit some of these things?
I think the time is there. Not only the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but the Voting Rights Act of 1965. You're quite right in saying that we're now beyond the 40th anniversary. I think July 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed, introduced and passed. But you're quite right. I think we need to revisit these pieces of legislation and to see where we went wrong, see what hasn't been done right up to this point, and perhaps expand on these pieces of civil rights legislation, perhaps to create new pieces of legislation to address the economic realities that we face in American society today. I think the problem of civil rights, we have civil rights, basic constitutional rights, but the problem is the lack of economic justice, which was the last part of Dr. King's crusade. He was involved in that when he was killed. We need civil rights legislation to address, to go beyond 1964, to deal not only with employment opportunities, job discrimination, but to deal with the whole question of how to bring about economic equality.
Okay, and of course what we'll do, we'll talk about that when we return following this short commercial break. The topic is the civil